Both Al-Qaeda and ISIS are present in Afghanistan. One of the reasons why Al-Qaeda, I think, has found it so difficult to regroup in Western Pakistan and Eastern Afghanistan is because of the relentless military pressure that the United States has put them under. That's going to be far, far harder now that the Taliban is in charge, not only because the United States won't have a presence in the country, which it won't, and therefore won't have the kind of intelligence and the kind of military operations available to it to do what we have done for 20 years. But to this day, the Taliban has never broken with Al-Qaeda, despite 20 years of pressure on them to do precisely that. Some of the Taliban families have intermarried with Al-Qaeda. The Haqqani network, which is a portion of the Taliban, is very linked with Al-Qaeda. And they will not break with Al-Qaeda. And you know, the UN did a report recently that talked about Afghanistan and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and the Al-Qaeda leadership still being present and in Afghanistan and linked to the Taliban. That can't be encouraging from the things we care about from a homeland security perspective. ISIS is a little harder because the Taliban has actually fought ISIS. They don't like ISIS, and ISIS doesn't like them. Whether it stays that way, who knows? But there may be some almost equilibrium where the Taliban and ISIS fight each other in Afghanistan.
Can we talk about Iran for a moment? Does this create an opportunity? The US's departure from Afghanistan creates something of a vacuum. Does it create an opportunity that for Iran to fill that vacuum?
I was thinking about this today. I think the Iranians must have a lot of mixed feelings about today. On the one hand, if you go all the way back to the 1990s Taliban, they were mortal enemies of Iran. I mean, they do not like Shia governments, and they don't like Shia Muslims very much themselves, which they see as not real Muslims. They executed a bunch of Iranian diplomats in the 1990s. Iran almost went to war with the Taliban over it. They ultimately didn't. You fast forward till a few years ago, and there were a lot of reports about Iran actually arming the Taliban, providing weapons. And you say, wait a minute, how is that possible? Well, it was the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They would, you know, the Taliban's enemy was the United States, and Iran's enemy was the United States. And so they thought they'd, you know, help us bleed there. And okay, so we're out, but now in charge of a country of 30 million on the Iranian border is the old government that never really liked the Iranians in the first place. How does that manifest itself? Well, I don't know. We're going to have to see whether it's with respect to Shia and Iran, it's more like the 90s Taliban, or, you know, they've become they're changed since then. So I think there's probably some sense of both vindication among the Iranians, but also worry about, you know, what's to come now that the United States is going to be out of the picture.
Trump did agree to this peace treaty with the Taliban that said the US was going to exit Afghanistan. When Biden had come into office, he had an option not to honor that. Is that what you think he should have done?
Yes, I think that, well, first, the peace agreement was pretty flawed, and it did force the issue for Biden in a way that it hadn't been forced before, because the issue, because as part of the ceasefire against the Americans was linked to the US guarantee of withdrawal. So the Biden team came in and was faced not with, you know, fighting between the US and the Taliban and do you stay or do you go, but rather no fighting between the United States and the Taliban. And if you stay, you probably reactivate that fighting. And if you leave, then you activate the sort of collapse that we saw. So that was kind of the thing on offer. But if you look at what the Taliban agreed to, they agreed to not move on the provincial capitals. They didn't do that. They were in violation of a number of the terms of the agreement. And of course, they consistently said things like, you know, that as recently as earlier today, they said they weren't going to take Kabul until a few hours later. And they said, well, actually, we have to. So I think that the Taliban was manifestly in breach of some of the things that it agreed to in the peace agreement. If the Biden administration would have been within its rights to say, we'll leave, but on condition that you fulfill the terms of the agreement, not we'll leave based on a date on the calendar.
So this might be a little speculation, but I know you know people. Why do you think they decided to do it anyway? They knew the risks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately the president thought this was not a war worth fighting anymore, and fighting was going to come back into play if the United States stayed, and he thought it wasn't worth it. It was, grinding up American lives and resources for way too long with marginal, if any, benefit, a distraction from bigger issues like the challenges we have at home and the strategic challenge we have from China and things like that. And he didn't want to send American men and women to fight for a government that didn't seem like it was willing to fight for itself. And that's, I understand that point of view. I mean, it's not a frivolous point of view. The problem is it's like anything else in life. You have to compare it to the available alternative.
There's some people in this audience who were very young when 9/11 happened and aren't familiar with the Taliban. Can you give us a sense of what Taliban rule could mean for some of those people if they have to stay?
Well, if it looks like the Taliban rule of the 1990s, it meant that generally speaking, girls couldn't go to school. Women rarely left the houses. If they did, they couldn't work. If they did, they had to be clad in burqas, which covers your whole face. And if you go to downtown Kabul, at any point you'll see women walking around in burqas, but it's not compulsory to do that. They made that compulsory. Men had to have beards of a certain length. TV was basically banned. Music was basically banned. And they tried to put in very strict Islamic rule with extremely brutal penalties for infractions, to include, mass executions, hanging people, amputations, these kinds of things. That's the kind of rule that they had there before. God willing, now that they're going to be in charge, that won't be the kind of rule we have now. But if you look also at some of the areas that the Taliban has conquered over, not just the past few days, but the past months, you see signs of all those things where, women are told to stay home. Girls are told that after a certain age, you can't go to school. Women who work in the government told, you don't have a job here anymore. There are contested reports of forced marriages, including with very young girls and things like that. So a lot is going to turn on how the Taliban rules the cities in particular, starting essentially right now when the people of Kabul, which is a city of 6 million, and these other cities like Mazar-i-Sharif and Kandahar and when they wake up this morning, their time, they will be in essentially a different country.
One can imagine that on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we'll see a Taliban flag flying over what was once the U.S. embassy there. What does this do to the U.S.'s standing in the world?
That is a complicated question. And I've been reading and listening to some of the kind of takes on this, where people say, oh, this is a sign of American decline, and this shows that, it's all over, or, America is no longer the bastion of liberty and that it used to be, or that our credibility is totally shot. And of course, a lot of people are also making this comparison with 1975 and the fall of Saigon. And I think that all of these historical analogies to some degree bother me a little bit, because I think they end up sometimes shedding more heat than light. But let's say it's like the fall of Saigon. Well, of course, on that day and in 1975, things looked absolutely awful for the United States. We just lost the longest war in our history 2 years before, and then the country we tried to maintain in South Vietnam for 2 years after that falls to the enemy that we fought against for so long, right? And we had a peace agreement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, fast forward 5 years, 1981, and Ronald Reagan is in charge, and there's a huge defense buildup, and he's talking about the evil empire. And fast forward 8 years from that, and the Berlin Wall comes down, and 2 years later, we win the Cold War. So that clearly was not, didn't point to America's decline in the world. Certainly this will rattle some of our allies who say, hey, what's your staying power look like? Do you just abandon allies in the field? Although you could say 20 years is quite a long time. I thought it was the wrong thing to withdraw, but 20 years is not nothing to support allies that are working with you. But I think different countries, whether it's adversaries or allies, will interpret this in different ways. And I just don't think you can net out and say in these sweeping generalizations, as I've heard a lot of today, that, America's standing is shot, or alternatively, as some of the administration would like to have it, ultimately this will be great because it'll show that we're able at even high price to sort of get rid of the frivolous marginal things and really focus on our core interests. Like, let's wait and see. I think this will hit different people in different ways.
Hi, I'm Jessica Yellin. If you like this video, please click subscribe, and you can click the bell to get notifications when we post new content. Thanks for watching.